voice from Jesse.
We're here. Oh, did she say that? What? Hey, we're live. Hey.
Good morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening, wherever you are. I'm scrolling down to see if anybody actually put any comments on anything. Nope, nobody. No, that's all right. I know they listen. I know they love us. I actually did get a comment the other day from someone, a random person who is slightly connected to our church.
Okay.
And he said, I just love listening to you and Brian. You're like the Smothers Brothers.
Well, I can see that. Yeah. We've known each other for, 15 years. So there's definitely a dynamic that kind of comes with that. And I would even say it's somewhat brotherly in that there are times when we just tick each other off. And but we also know each other well enough that, we recover fairly quickly when that kind of happens.
Yeah. I'll just leave that one alone. I want to ask is, when did I tick you off?
Oh, no. I mean, I think, there are definitely times when we can kind of bristle. Most of the time, we don't. And I think one of the things that we do well is I think that we tend to be pretty respectful around these theological topics, which is kind of strange, I think, because this is an area where things are thorny. I mean, if you look at marriages, in that list of things that can cause discord, money, politics, and religion are the top three. Yeah. And I think you and I, there's definitely in the Venn diagram of our belief system, there's a lot of overlap, but it's not completely on, there's definitely areas where we have different viewpoints in there, and we don't need to talk about money because that's not part of our relationship.
No, yeah, but there's a respect. I appreciate your opinion. You appreciate mine. We listen to each other. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
And that's the way it needs to be with all these topics. So speaking about politics, though, and this book, I thought we would finish chapter 3. Does that sound good? Okay.
Yeah.
Because I don't think we got through it all. I think there was still too much there that we could have. Here, I'm going to try and get my there we go. My notes up. I wanted my notes up so I can. What I thought about the chapter. There we go. Oh, okay, perfect. There we go. So, why don't you go first? I usually go first.
Oh, okay.
What do you?
Well, what I was going to do is I've got I'm bringing up my notes right now as well. But the chapter itself, and I don't know if we touched on this last week, starts with an interaction with family and friends that the author had that resulted in basically an impassioned partisan political debate or argument within that group, and that I like the quote here: "Anger reveals our loyalties," and if we have fractured relationships because of partisan politics, we need to ask whether we are placing too much hope in political promises. And this is, and to me, that really speaks to this area of the chapter that we're going to discuss, especially in an environment where it's a bit of a hair trigger for some folks that where certain partisan topics tend to raise the ire of people. And I had asked you a question. We were, in our little chat group before we got started, and I don't want to start with that question, but that was just the idea that what's the measure of the weight that we put into these topics, and is it an appropriate level in comparison to the weight that we put into our allegiance and relationship with Christ.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of where we need to go for the whole thing. I feel like this chapter he finally starts to truly articulate how we are to work, how this is supposed to work. Did you feel like that a little bit?
Definitely. Yeah, there was definitely a transitional chapter where he's provided this foundation that has demonstrated that Christ is political. The world he was in, he was a political figure and created conflict politically in that arena. So it's kind of like it kind of undermines the idea that our faith isn't political. He also makes sure that we understand that we're talking about politics not in the framework of partisan politics, but more in subverting who is the true king, who is the ultimate leader. So I think now we're transitioning into, okay, here we are today. How should we engage with each other, or how should we even evaluate how we ourselves are processing information related to politics?
Yeah, where he's made the twin points of be submissive to governments, but at the same time, you need to be subversive and not partisan in the sense of, to translate it to American culture, we're not right or left, we're partisan with the kingdom of God. That's our tribe that we are to be evaluating for him, I think. And so, I'm starting to get an answer of what to do. I'm ready to start thinking through more details. But I'm excited about that. I'm definitely getting pushed. But I suppose we can start listing some of this stuff out. Now, I came up with a nice little, what I think was a summary. You listed some quotes ahead of time that you thought were good. Which would be better, do you think?
Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with a quote that I came across, and to me, it in some ways encapsulates the notes that you provided to me. And that is, for a Christian, the political life must begin inside the church. And I also noted, this is not a quote from the book, in this context, political life is the reminder that Jesus is king, and we reaffirm our allegiance to Jesus when we take communion.
I wrote that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I highlighted that.
Yeah. So that when we say something like it must begin with the church, it's, in my mind, it's like before we ever try to take on the mantle of any political party here in the United States, we need to have, we've been talking about the armor of God, right? We've been talking about that. But the first thing that we should be putting on, and really the first thing I think other people should see about us, is not conservative or progressive, but follower of Christ.
Yeah, that's a good point that I don't think I put in my brain first. Would you say that what he's saying that, okay, but there's a lot behind this statement that I need to back, but that we mostly should be speaking to the church in regards to our critiques of the culture, about how to be like the kingdom, to live out the kingdom ethos, culture.
I think I agree with that. I'm going to reframe it a little bit. That if you picked me up and then you put me in Australia, right, where I don't know the politics, I don't know the political figures, I don't know who the parties are or anything, would the way that I interact with the world is not going to be determined by a Republican or a Democratic party in the United States. It's going to be, I'm a follower of Christ. That should be foundationally where I lead from, is, trying to look at Christ as a model in my engagement with the world. So, or if you picked me up and put me in Indonesia, right, where I don't even speak the language, how can I ensure that my engagement with people is reflective of Christ?
I also just realized I'm reading this book from the perspective of a pastor to what is a pastor supposed to do.
Right.
I realize that that's what I'm doing. Okay, because that helps explain it. But okay. All right. So, yes, and I highlighted that, and I had the same kind of comment. In fact, I responded to yours with, where was it? Where was my quote? Oh, he said something a little bit earlier in that little section that no political allegiance should rival or compare to our allegiance in Jesus. It's kind of the same thing. And I wrote in there Matthew 10:17, which I assume you didn't look that up. Did you look it up?
I did not look it up. But do you want to share that?
It does, and it's a hard one. It's no one who well, there's a couple of variations. Luke has it slightly different, but it's no one who loves his mother or father more than me is worthy to be my disciple. And now Luke puts it, hates his mother and father, is not worthy of being my disciple. But the point is like, who's your allegiance? And I've only ever read that in terms of, well, okay, family lines. But even then, of course, that's super hard. But I think that's what his point is. He's like, wait a minute, where's your heart? Who do you love more? Do you love me, the kingdom of God, the church, or do you love the government, your political party? And Jesus is drawing a very hard line there. It's who's the most important thing in your life? That's and if it's not him, wow, I don't even like to say what he's saying. It's one of those hard statements of Jesus. But I think that's one of the basic points.
Well, and that was such a difficult passage, and I think one of the few sermons that I have done was on that topic, and it was on that specific passage. But it should be convicting to all of us. Yeah. There are very, very few people that can say from an objective viewpoint that their relationship with Christ is first, and it's reflected in the way that they engage with the world. And that's not to be critical of anybody. It's just hard.
Yeah.
It's harder now than it ever has been. And it's because it's not just parties. It's not just your family. It's objects. It's status. It's your profession. There are so many things that are vying for that top spot, and we get so many conflicting messages around it. It really, in many ways, speaks to simplicity, and also because there are so many things that are vying for that, it's a little easier for something like partisan politics to sneak in on the top, because if Jesus gets 10% and that's the biggest piece, but then there's like an 8 and a 9 and a 7%, underneath that. Jesus is just barely there. So something can come in and take your passion.
Yeah.
Even on a temporary basis.
And I understand what you're saying, and I'm not disagreeing with it. My question is the analogy of percent the right analogy in this case? Because that's a very modern Western way of looking at things.
Sure.
And I'm not sure that that's how he would put it in that framework. I think identity is a better way of thinking about who's your foundational identity. I think
right.
With modern now, but that is biblical. Who are you? Who does your heart belong to?
Well, and you also need to ask percent of what. And I'm not talking about time. When I say percent, it's kind of like...
Yeah, then that gets into evaluation.
Right. But I think identity is the right way. Even when I in social media, like in social media profiles, as I was writing my profile, I'm like, well, how do I describe myself? And what's the first identity that I describe? And that that's something that I consider follower of Christ is probably first, and husband and father, and somewhere there's a disc golfer and worship leader. But
where do you list first? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think this is his first, and he actually kind of says this is the first way that you live it out, is this idea of where is your identity or your loyalty primarily at, and that we need to be looking at the world, responding to the world from that perspective. And this is where, when my summary was, to be and to teach and train believers to have that as their primary identity. That's what I'm kind of re-saying when you said it starts in the church. It starts in the church, us being citizens of the kingdom, but it's also learning and thinking that way and putting that as the main way we look at the world from that vantage point, from that. And I use the word alien vantage point, meaning not inside the culture, but stepping outside of it.
Well, you said something earlier that I think tweaks my viewpoint on this a little bit. It helps me understand it a little bit better. When you said you have been reading this book from the vantage of a pastor. So your identity as you're reading this book is as a pastor, and that changes the way that you engage with the information that you're receiving, right? So if, let's say, you hear people say this in conversations sometimes, they'll come and asking for advice. Like our friend Mark Lyons is a lawyer, right? Yeah. And if you came and asked him a question, he may say, do you want my answer as a lawyer, or do you want my answer as your friend?
Yeah,
right?
He does. Yeah.
Right. And there's a big difference there, right? As a lawyer, he's going to couch things differently. It's going to be from a legal perspective, or like my accountant. My accountant might say something like, as your accountant, you should do this. Now, as a guy, we're just having a conversation here. I think that's stupid, and I wouldn't do that if I didn't have to tell you to do it this way. So to me, I think that helps me understand a bit better that what hat do you put on when you're engaging with somebody. So for me, when I lived in Seattle, and this is more than 20 years ago, at work, I had people call me Joseph. And any place else, my name was Joe. What that did for me is if I'm walking downtown and somebody goes, hey, Joseph, I know they're talking to me as a coworker. And that changes the way I engage with them. And when they said, hey, Joe, I know it's a friend from outside of work, and I would engage with them differently.
Yeah. Yeah. Which identity? Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a really good analogy. And so so his 2 points were identity, not putting your hope in human efforts to make this world perfect, and then act like the kingdom, doing good, be righteous, act justly, all of that sort of stuff. I think those are his 2 ideas. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then for me, the question then becomes things like, well, how do you know which hat you put on? I mean, there's 2. How do you know which hat you have on? And then, how do you act in accordance to the kingdom? And I don't think, and that second one is, the part of the question with that is I don't think you can act in accordance with the kingdom unless you know how the culture's not like the kingdom.
Sure. Yeah, you have to be able to differentiate or understand. One thing he talks about is how leadership is always, like earthly leadership, is always going to fail.
Right. Right. Right.
It,
And so I was talking about evaluate. We need to, I think we need to be able to evaluate different political parties, right, left, cultural movements, all of that stuff from that kingdom vantage point. But you have to assume there's always something wrong with it.
right.
There's, if your political party is generally on the right, what's wrong with the right? There's probably a lot. There has to be a lot. Why? It's run by sinners. It's
Right.
part of the right. If you lean left, what's wrong with the left? What's wrong with Biden? Just like you need to know what's wrong with Trump. What's wrong with America? You need to be able to know. If you love America, what's wrong with it?
Yeah.
You have to be able to know this.
And acknowledging the human frailty and the messiness of people, I think, helps you love people more wholly, in a more full sense. That at the point where you are afraid to acknowledge the failures or the weaknesses of your human leadership, you have started to deify them.
Yeah.
Right? Like, well, they can't make a mistake, because if I acknowledge they make a mistake, then the other people that I don't agree with are going to jump on me, right? So we've created this, it's that whole idea of certainty. I'm certain my leader is perfect because they represent my party. And if you start with what we're talking about here, foundationally, with the idea that they're all flawed, then it gives you permission to go, yeah, that wasn't great. Oh,
It does. And being able to see the other side, what are they right? What are they correct about? Being from a right perspective, looking at what they're trying to say, even if they can't say it correctly, and the same thing for the right. What are they getting at that's actually a good thing, a right thing? Because you need to be able to see it all. You need to be that. I think that's a way to help kind of be able to pull yourself out from the ground level inside the muck of the thing of the right or left perspective, to be able to go from God's perspective, from the kingdom perspective, what's right, what's wrong about all the different cultural things. What's wrong with the social justice movement? What do they have right? What don't they have right? All of it. You need to be able to do that. And I don't think you can be I think you have to be able to say that.
Oh, I agree. Yeah, in the same way that you have to acknowledge the flaws in the people that you support, let's say, then you also have to acknowledge the good that's in the people that you don't necessarily politically align with. And part of the issue is that whole word align. Like, well, why are you even aligning there? Like, okay, well, let's align with Christ, and then it's a little easier to go, okay, I'm not a big fan of that. And to know that your perspective comes from that first identity of Christ as King.
And maybe we shouldn't even be aligned with any of them other than Jesus.
Yeah.
But in terms of what are you going to promote or support, particularly at the ballot box, because eventually all this is going to have to get down to how do you vote to a certain degree.
Yeah.
Which, okay. But I know this is a little off topic, but not really. It's like at a certain point, you have to acknowledge that there's no perfect parties, there's no perfect candidate. It's always the lesser of two evils. Always.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to use an example. John Edwards was the political left was so enamored with him as a candidate because he was young and good looking, and he had a beautiful wife and this perfect family, and it was like the second coming of JFK, and I, to a certain extent, I bought into that. And then his wife had cancer, and we found out he was having a long-term affair with somebody, and at some point he was put up on this idealistic pedestal, and then he's just a human, and then he gets torn down. That that we're putting our faith in the wrong people in the wrong place. And when you create that kind of false idealistic person, they are absolutely going to fail. And we just need to know that they're going to fail. And and to the point you made several weeks ago, that whoever's in power, we need to pray for them, because what we really want is we want good to come from them that ultimately supports the kingdom of God. And
care about.
Right. So,
Yeah. And so, just the assumption that they're going to fail, but you can't put your hope in them. I think he made that point in the book, because I think I had that quote. Is just, we can't put our hope that any government, any social movement ultimately is going to get everything that people want. It's never going to fully produce perfect justice.
Yeah.
Humans fail. That's a foundational point of Scripture, is that we just can't get it right.
Yeah. Which is in some way one of the most beautiful things about us, is that, our flaws, our frailty, are that continuous reminder that we need Jesus. And then we can embrace that as a reality. We're not necessarily celebrating it. It's just that reminder, like, I don't have it together.
And that's true individually, which we often can remember, but we have to expand that. Remember, that's also true of governments and cultures and movements. American culture, there's some good things about American culture. There's some things that are not. There's some great things about capitalism. There's some things that are not.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. You just have to apply it on a grander scale, because all of those things are built on the same thing. Human nature is sinful. There you have it.
Yeah.
All right. Is there you talk about this one?
This point or this week?
This week.
I did want to talk about one thing, just because I felt like it was in the conclusion of the chapter, and I really felt like it was a great example of how this whole thing is applied.
Okay, good.
And it was the topic of COVID-19 and the mask mandate.
Oh, yes.
And in the example, I'll just read it if it's okay.
Yeah, please do.
I met a lot of Christians who didn't want to wear masks during the pandemic. One told me he would walk into Home Depot without one, and the workers would request that he put on a mask. He would respond, "Call the cops on me if you wish." They never did. Is this the way of subversion? No. This is defining our freedom more by American ideals than by God's kingdom. The mask mandate did not discriminate. All people had to wear them. In addition, the purpose of the mask mandate was public health, but the purpose of the segregation laws, this is comparing this to a discussion of Martin Luther King earlier, the purpose of the segregation laws was to enshrine a difference of worth and value. So I just felt like this was a really good example of how do we apply the kingdom first mentality or thought process in a practical sense. And, the subversion that MLK Jr. And the way that he was fighting against segregation in a peaceful way, he was doing that because there was in society enshrined this difference between people, that some people had more value than others or more worth than others. Whereas the mask mandate is like, listen, we're all going to do it, and we're doing it because it's supposed to help people. Now, you may not agree with the scientific data and the way that it leads, to that discussion or where it lands.
Whether or not it was effective wasn't the point.
Correct.
That wasn't the point. What's interesting, though, in this point is how not careful even Christian leaders, many of them were, on this topic. They didn't carefully think it through, and so they didn't carefully teach their people. For example, in that case, that's just pure rebellion, not wearing it in Home Depot. How is, the government is saying to do this. What's your argument to not obey them? There isn't one, other than you just don't agree with it. Well, that's called rebellion.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you could argue, and I don't think it's a good argument, not to gather because it's breaking the command of God to worship together. I don't think that was a good argument, but even if that's the argument, and I agreed with that argument, not going in Home Depot has nothing to do with it.
Right.
That's irrelevant. That's completely two different circumstances. And so it's like, I don't think I should have to wear a shirt when I go into a restaurant. Doesn't matter. That's the rule.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? That's the rule. That's what you do. And so it's just, and so I think that moment really, instead of revealing subversiveness, it actually revealed rebellion. And we have to be really careful that our subversiveness is not just mass rebellion.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something I think we have to, it's something that it was a growing edge, a place where we should acknowledge that we're not good at it and then put in deliberate efforts to get better. Put that pause button in there. And this is, for me on social media, that's always the case. But, hey, I feel really strongly about this, so I'm going to fire out this response. And then before you ever send it or share a post that somebody shared, go, okay, what am I saying here? What hat am I wearing when I share this or when I respond in this way? What am I putting forth first? Is it my
me wearing? What hat are they going to put on my head when I share that?
Right, because other people are going to evaluate your motivations. And so if your response, they may look at your response and they could go, well, that's Pastor Brian. He must be wearing the pastor hat. And therefore I need to, what's that? Right.
They're assuming I'm wearing it. I always wear it. Now, that's easy for me because I think that I live that, but that's not always the case. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like I have a responsibility in my leadership role to respond to things in a specific way, because that is kind of it's just a responsibility I have in the leadership role to try to be above certain things, which is why I generally don't respond to things unless it's, here's some more information on that. I'm not sure this is correct.
Is you try to get people to, let's critically evaluate whatever is being stated so that we can think about it from that other that alien perspective, that outside perspective.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think the COVID-19 point illustration, two things. I think it's going to be a good illustration for us to think, as an example, to think through what he's going to go through for the rest of the book. And also it taught me we as the church have a lot of learning to do, because that issue, that kind of an issue, is going to come up again and again and again.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, thank you for joining us today. And again, if you have questions, comments, things you don't agree with us, let us know. And we would love to hear from you. And I'll see you guys on Sunday.
See you Sunday, folks. Take care.